They say blood protects you. I carried that belief like a family crest until the night I watched my name slide off a will like wet ink. I am Adam Hart, and the people who raised me tried to write me out of my own life. They smiled as they did it. That smile told me more than any letterhead could. Hart House in Surrey looks honest from the lane, red brick and ivy, a garden that remembers summer better than I do. Inside, the air stays careful. My stepmother, Victoria, prefers a kind of quiet that bends other people into shape. My brother, Charles, learned that silence before I did. When my father, Edward, died, Victoria kept the house running like a theater. Flowers that never wilted. Curtains that never moved. Voices that never rose. Grief had a timetable, and I was late to it. The first slippage was my surname spoken like it did not belong to me. Victoria passed a folder across the oak table and said, very softly, that father had been clear. Graham Wilcox, the family solicitor, avoided my eyes. Charles watched me the way a referee watches the pitch. I opened the folder and saw the Hart Family Settlement, 2004, with a fresh amendment clipped to the front. Under new terms, control moved to Victoria as trustee. Voting rights pooled with Charles. My share of the Surrey estate, the Bayswater flat, and the yard, reduced to something you could list on one line of a receipt. I read it twice and felt the room lean hard to one side. When I asked for the original deed and the trustee minutes, Wilcox said the papers were in archive, and I would have them soon. Soon meant never in this house. I thanked him, stood up, and said nothing else, because I had already seen the pen stroke that did not look like my father's. He used a small flourish on the crossbar of his H. This H sat flat and tired. It looked like a photocopy trying to pass as a hand. At dinner, Victoria asked about my work in Hampstead and poured wine into a glass I had not touched. Charles spoke about dividend schedules like a lullaby. Margaret and Thomas Reed joined by video call from Kent and said the right words about family unity. Oliver joked about lawyers. They tested the surface for cracks. I kept my voice calm and let them think I was still that boy who missed the small print. Later, in Father's study, I closed the door and opened the drawer he used for letters he never posted. He had nothing of value there in their eyes, so no one bothered to empty it. The envelope at the back was addressed to me. The date was 3 days before the ambulance. He wrote in his heavy hand that he wanted me to lead the trust after him, that he had told Wilcox to draft it, that he trusted my judgment over the others because I did not confuse love with money. The letter smelled faintly of his tobacco. I pressed my thumb to the paper and felt the ridges where the pen had dug in. I folded the letter and slid it inside my coat. In London, I met Phoebe Clark at a cafe behind the Royal Courts of Justice. She read the letter, then the copies of the amendment I had requested, which finally reached me with the worst timing, slipped through my letterbox without a cover note. Phoebe said nothing for a long time, then asked me to describe my father's signature without looking. I told her about the crossbar, the pressure on the downstroke, the way he lifted the pen after the T, a habit from school. She nodded, took a breath, and said we would need a forensic opinion and the trustee minutes. The minutes would tell us who had voted and when. If the minutes did not exist, that said even more. I returned to Surrey and looked for the archive Wilcox had promised. I got a closed door and a line about data protection. On the way out, I noticed a new framed photograph on the hall table. Father, Victoria, and Charles at a charity gala. The date sat in the corner, glossy and precise, 2 months after Father had stopped going out at night. I remembered driving him home from his last dinner and how he coughed through the speech he tried to practice. That gala picture lived in a world that did not include me. I called Oliver and asked him to meet me at a pub near the river. He arrived on time and looked relieved to be away from the house. He told me quietly that there had been late-night meetings in Father's study while Father slept upstairs, doors half open, papers on the table, Wilcox leaving just before dawn. He had not told me because he did not know what any of it meant then. It means this, I said, and showed him the letter. He read it twice and gripped the edge of the table until his knuckles turned white. Phoebe secured Dr. Henry Caldwell, who examined high-resolution scans of the signatures and the ink. His report came back with words that made my breath stop. The signature on the amendment displayed signs inconsistent with Edward Hart's known hand. Layering suggested lift and trace. The ink sequence did not match the date stamp. I stared at the page as if it were a window, and behind it I could see Victoria's careful smile. That same afternoon, a thin package arrived at my flat. No return address. Inside, printed minutes from a trustee meeting that placed my father at the head of the table 3 days after a hospital consultant had recorded him as unfit to manage his affairs. The minute recorded a vote to shift control to Victoria and Charles. The signature at the bottom was father's name without his hand. I stood at the window and watched buses pass in the rain and thought about how people talk about family like a shelter. Then I folded the report, the minutes, and my father's letter into one file. I did not shake. I did not cry. I made tea and called Phoebe. We would issue the claim in the High Court. We would ask for disclosure. We would put the letter in front of Mrs. Justice Whitmore. And when Victoria and Charles turned to Wilcox for help, I would show them something they had not considered. They thought I had nothing. They thought they had erased me. They forgot that I know their secrets. Ashgrove Holdings Limited. The Bayswater flat. The night meetings that began before father could sign his own name. I would set it all down, piece by piece, in a place where smiles do not matter. I would not walk away. I would turn on the lights, and I would watch who ran. People in Surrey would say the Hart family name with respect. At luncheons and charity balls, people clapped Victoria on the shoulder and called her elegant. They treated Charles like the natural heir to Edward Hart's business legacy. To outsiders, we were wealth with manners, a dynasty with red brick roots. But I knew that the higher a mask sits, the sharper the drop when it falls. At Hart House, everything looked controlled. The drive was lined with clipped hedges and gravel that crunched politely under tires. Inside, portraits of ancestors stared down as if waiting for me to remember my place. Guests saw tradition, wealth, stability. I saw stagecraft. Victoria made sure the curtains were drawn at the same angle every morning. Charles rehearsed his charm until it sounded natural. Even the laughter at the table followed her rhythm. Never too loud, never too risky. My position was different. I was Edward's son, but Victoria reminded me with every glance that I was not hers. When father was alive, I could push back against her cool control. Without him, my voice shrank inside those high-ceilinged rooms. I became the guest in my own house. At dinners, I was seated on the side, never at the center. At board meetings, I was introduced as a junior consultant to projects that bore my family's name. People nodded politely, dismissed my words, then turned their full attention back to Charles. I tried to convince myself that it was grief creating the distance, that people cope with loss in different ways. But the truth surfaced in small, careless details. I would walk into the study and find conversations cut short. Letters disappeared from father's desk drawers. Even the house staff, people who had watched me grow up, began to avoid my eyes. It was as if Victoria had extended her silence to cover them all. The cracks were faint at first. Receipt tucked into a book in the library. Thousands of pounds withdrawn from the trust and marked as maintenance, though no maintenance had been done. A delivery at the door for Ashgrove Holdings, a name I had never heard but which Charles claimed was just another investment. A whispered argument between Victoria and Graham Wilcox in the garden, cut off the moment I appeared. They waved it away, said it was about donations, but I caught the edge of Wilcox's expression. He looked frightened. When I asked Charles directly why the trust documents listed Ashgrove Holdings as a creditor, he smirked. He told me that business was complicated and perhaps beyond my understanding. That smirk stung more than any insult. It was the look of a man certain that he held every card. But something else gnawed at me. Why were they hiding? If everything had been as lawful and clean as they claimed, they would not have buried paperwork or silenced conversations. Why did the solicitor who once treated me like family suddenly behave as though my questions were threats? One evening, Victoria hosted a dinner with local counselors. I sat quietly, listening. The counselors praised her for her charitable work, thanked her for her donations, admired her vision for new housing projects. Victoria glowed under their admiration. Charles leaned in and spoke confidently about future ventures. They made us look like a family in full harmony. Yet I noticed Oliver Reed, my cousin, shift uncomfortably whenever housing estates were mentioned. His hands tightened around his wine glass. Later, as guests left, I caught his eye. For a second, he looked at me with something like pity. Then he turned away. In that moment, I realized I was not imagining the cracks. They were real, widening, sharp. And if Oliver looked at me with pity, it meant he knew more than he was willing to say. I returned to my room that night, and lay awake, staring at the ceiling beams father once pointed out to me as a child, telling me they were strong enough to hold storms. Now those beams felt like witnesses, watching me live inside a stage set that the world adored but that reeked of deception. They underestimated me because I was quiet, because I did not fight at every dinner table, because I watched instead of shouted. But I understood something they did not. Silence is not weakness. It is preparation. Why was the family hiding so much? And why did I feel that the moment I asked the right question, their perfect facade would come crashing down? The will reading should have been simple. A solemn moment, a last tie to my father, Edward Hart. Instead, it was a theater built for humiliation. The family gathered in the drawing room of Hart House. Victoria sat like a queen at the head of the table, Charles at her right, Margaret and Thomas Reed facing me, Oliver off to the side, restless. Graham Wilcox, the solicitor, placed his leather folder on the polished table and began. At first, it sounded fair. Father's personal belongings, his books, his letters, passed to me. I almost smiled at the mention of his old fountain pen, because he had promised it would be mine since I was 12. But then Wilcox's tone shifted. The Surrey estate, Hart House, transferred under Victoria's trusteeship. The Bayswater flat, designated for Charles. Company shares, pooled into Ashgrove Holdings, controlled by Victoria and Charles jointly. My name appeared only in fragments, small allowances, minor accounts, items of sentimental value. The air tightened. Margaret adjusted her glasses and nodded as though she had expected nothing less. Thomas cleared his throat with self-importance. Oliver looked down at the floor. I kept my expression still, but inside my chest the world cracked. I raised my hand, interrupting Wilcox. That is not what my father told me, I said. He promised the trust would pass to me. He put it in writing. Victoria's lips curved into that controlled smile of hers. Adam, grief distorts memory. You must not let sorrow confuse you. Charles leaned forward. You have always been emotional. Father wanted stability. He chose people who could run the estate, not drown it in sentiment. They spoke as if I were a child, as if my memory, my relationship with my father, were delusions. I glanced at Wilcox. He refused my eyes, shuffling his papers. Where are the trustee minutes? I asked. Where is the record of these changes? Wilcox cleared his throat. They exist. You shall receive copies. Victoria placed her hand over mine like a gesture of pity. Darling, you must accept that you were never meant to bear this burden. Father cared for you deeply, but he wanted you free of responsibilities too heavy for you. You should be grateful. Grateful for being erased from my father's legacy, for being treated like a liability in front of the people who should have stood beside me. The room tilted, not because of shock, but because of rage contained too tightly. They did not stop there. Margaret leaned forward, eyes sharp behind her glasses. Adam, you have been careless. Your flat in Hampstead has been the subject of gossip. Late nights, strange friends. Do you think donors do not hear such things? The accusation was a blade slid under the table. They were not just taking the estate, they were dismantling my name. I had neighbors, colleagues, friends. They meant to spread doubt until I was nothing but scandal and whispers. Charles pressed the attack. You cannot manage yourself, let alone the Hart estate. We are protecting you from yourself. The silence that followed pressed into my ribs. I saw Oliver twitch, open his mouth, then close it again. He would not risk crossing Victoria. Not then. I pushed my chair back. The scrape of the legs on the floor cut through the stillness. You think I will stand here and swallow lies? I asked. You forged his name. You rewrote his trust. And you sit here pretending it was his choice. Victoria's face remained smooth, but her eyes flickered. She did not like the word forged. Not spoken aloud. Thomas gave a dry laugh. Careful, Adam. Those are dangerous words. Dangerous only if they are untrue, I replied. Victoria leaned in, voice soft but full of steel. You will accept this arrangement. You will take your small share with grace. And you will not embarrass this family with wild accusations. Do you understand? Her tone was the final blow, not a request, but a command. She wanted submission. She wanted me small, broken, humiliated. I looked around the table, at relatives who looked away, at a solicitor who had chosen complicity over truth, at a brother who smiled as though victory were inevitable. For a moment, the weight of it pressed down. They had stripped me of property, inheritance, reputation. In front of my blood, I had been turned into nothing. But even as their silence swallowed me, I felt something sharper rise inside. Rage, yes, but also clarity. They believed they had ended the fight before it began. They thought I had been destroyed. I stood, slid my chair back to the table, and looked each of them in the eye. "You will regret underestimating me," I said, "because I am not done. Not by a long way." No one spoke. Only Victoria's gaze held mine, steady and cold. I turned, walked from the room, and did not look back. In the hallway, my hands trembled, but not from defeat. From anticipation. Because hidden in my coat pocket was my father's letter, the one he wrote days before he died, naming me his successor. The letter none of them knew I had. They thought they had destroyed me. They had no idea what I had prepared. I laid the papers from the will reading on my kitchen table and stared at them until the ink seemed to darken. Phoebe told me to breathe, to keep my head clear, to separate anger from proof. I folded my father's letter into a hard rectangle and slid it into a plastic sleeve. Then I picked up a pen and wrote a list. Minutes, deeds, transfers, emails, company's house, every path that could lead to the truth. Oliver texted. Late that night. 2 words, back stair. Hart House had a back staircase that servants once used. It ended near a small storeroom off the study. I arrived before sunrise, let myself in with the spare key father kept under the 3rd stone, and moved through the quiet hall. The house felt awake and listening. There were fresh flowers on the hall table. Their scent made my stomach turn. The storeroom door stuck on a warped floorboard. I eased it open. Dust rose in a cloud. Blank labels on archive boxes looked at me like closed eyes. I chose the boxes that had the newest tape and the neatest handwriting, because people hide lies in tidy places. Inside I found papers that should have been dull. Invoices, maintenance requests, consultant agreements. The numbers were large and regular, like a metronome ticking through the trust's pulse. Each payment ran to a name that appeared again and again, Ashgrove Holdings Limited. I took photos of everything, front and back. Then I found a folder that did not fit the order. It held draft minutes from the trust. The dates lined up with the weeks father could not keep food down. Each minute listed those present. Edward Hart, in attendance and decisive, even though I had driven him home from hospital the same day. My hands shook as I read the line where the chair approved a bridge loan from the trust to Ashgrove for development opportunities. The figure sat on the page like a dare. I closed the box and took 3 folders with me. In the drive I saw Wilcox's car turn in. I slipped into the trees at the edge of the lawn and waited while he walked in through the side door without ringing. He had done that for years. The habit felt different now that I had a stack of copies in my bag. In London, Phoebe spread the papers on her office table. She did not speak for a long time. She circled the bridge loan with a pencil, then drew a line to 4 contractor invoices for roof repairs that never happened. Oliver's message about deliveries echoed in my head. All those crates marked for Ashgrove that had come and gone through the kitchen. Company's house record, Phoebe said at last. We start there. We ran the search. Ashgrove Holdings Ltd. sat behind a screen. 2 nominee directors. Registered office at a service address off Chancery Lane. Person with significant control filed as significant influence or control. Name withheld by protection regime. That protection is rare. It is granted when there is a risk of harm. The irony made me lightheaded. I looked again at the invoices. The contractor's name appeared generic, the kind that launders money through templated letterheads. I rang the number and reached a voicemail that used a different company name. The address on the invoice did not exist. Phoebe took notes and wrote a second list, subject access requests, bank statements for the trust accounts, full disclosure from Wilcox, preservation order on the study server. We prepared the letters before action. I wrote mine twice. The first draft bled anger. The second was lean. It demanded copies of minutes, trust accounts, and electronic records under the trustee's duties. I signed my name and felt something old and soft fall off my shoulders. Oliver sent me an email late that night from a new address. 2 attachments. The first was a scan of a memo on Wilcox's letterhead setting out a plan to restructure the Hart assets through Ashgrove for tax efficiency. The second was a printout of an email chain between Victoria and a counselor about a parcel of land on the edge of the village. The words were careful. The dates were not. The counselor had promised to smooth approvals in exchange for philanthropic support. A trust account payment went out 2 days later to a charity the counselor chaired. The charity banked at the same branch as Ashgrove. The amounts matched. I sent the files to Phoebe and met her at dawn. We skimmed the memo, the emails, the payments, the land registry entry. The titles charged in favor of Ashgrove, then released at strange hours, as if someone timed signatures to avoid questions. I felt heat behind my eyes and pushed it down. Grief would not help me now. Facts would. Phoebe called Dr. Henry Caldwell and handed him the amendment and the scans from the storeroom. He asked for a list of father's known signatures from different years and settings, checks, letters, even margin notes from his books. I brought a satchel to his office and watched him build a wall of evidence. He pinned a line of signatures across a board and marked pressure points with small arrows. Then he looked at the trust amendment and shook his head. The pen did not load the way father's pen loaded. The pressure through the downstroke fell off where father's hand used to grow heavier. The pause after the T was missing. Henry said the word that made my mouth go dry. Simulation. Phoebe filed the preservation application that afternoon, fast and hard. We wanted to lock down servers and backups before anyone could prune history. The judge granted it on paper with directions for a hearing. I felt a thread of breath come back into my lungs. I went home and opened my laptop. Another email from Oliver waited. This one held a photograph of a ledger page from Ashgrove that somebody had snapped on a phone. Columns of numbers, then notes, HH Roof, Bayswater Refurb, Consultancy, Donation. Each entry mirrored a payment out of the trust accounts. Then a final column, handwritten, tied each item to initials. V, C, T, G, Victoria, Charles, Thomas, Graham. I called Oliver at once. He answered in a whisper from his car. He said he had found the ledger in a box stored in the loft above the garage while looking for old camping gear. He did not know how long he would have access. He wanted me to know that when he laughed at dinner, he felt sick. Then he hung up. Phoebe brought in a forensic accountant named Patel. He pulled bank statements like thread and looked for the pattern that holds everything together. He found identical round numbers moving through 3 accounts within minutes of each other. He found consultancy, fees that returned to the same 2 payees through a different bank 2 weeks later. He mapped every payment from the trust to Ashgrove and back again on a single sheet. It looked like a spider's web over my father's name. I drove to Surrey again and sat in father's study with the lights off. The window showed the lawn like a pale sheet. I remembered the way he used to rest his hand on a page before signing. He used to speak the words, read slowly, like a blessing. I opened the bottom drawer of his desk and found a thumb drive in a small wooden box. Inside were drafts of letters he never sent, one addressed to me, one addressed to Wilcox. In the letter to Wilcox, he stated that no change to the trust would be valid without my written consent. The draft was dated a week before the amendment bearing his name. He never sent it. He had saved it here, under the place where his elbow used to rest. I left the house at dawn with the box in my coat. On the lane, I passed Margaret's car. She did not see me. Her face looked aged and pinched. For a moment, I almost felt pity. Then I remembered the way she had spoken in the drawing room. That memory scraped the pity down to the bone. Phoebe set the claim form in front of me at noon. We issued in the High Court, Chancery Division. We pleaded forgery, breach of trust, knowing receipt, dishonest assistance. We sought an account, a replacement of trustees, and orders to unwind Ashgrove's transfers. We listed the documents we wanted on disclosure, server logs, email archives, meeting invites, draft minutes with metadata. We put my father's letter at the heart of the case. The claim landed like a stone in a still pond. Phones rang in houses that had pretended to be asleep. Victoria's barrister, Sir Jonathan Vale, sent a letter heavy with threats. He called the allegations wild, the signatures authentic, the payments proper. He warned of costs, reputational damage, sanctions. Phoebe read the letter with a calm face and filed it in a folder marked noise. That evening I sat on my bed with the ledger printout, the emails, the memo, and the drafts from father's thumb drive spread around me like a map. I traced each line with a finger and made a new list of questions for disclosure. Which server stored the trustee minutes? Who held edit rights? Which device generated the PDFs? Where the backups lived? Dates, times, copies, versions. The law loves detail. Victoria had always loved stage sets. I would push her into a room where the only things that mattered were dates and signatures and money. I closed my eyes and saw father's handwriting again. The downstroke that never lied, the small lift after the T, the letter to me that smelled faintly of tobacco. I pictured the moment I would hand that letter to a clerk and watch it pass up to the bench. I pictured Victoria watching it travel, powerless to stop it. I looked at the ledger once more. The initials on the right-hand column gleamed like stains. If the court saw this, the trust would not survive as it stands. Hart House would not belong to a person who treated it like a stage. The Bayswater flat would not sit in Charles's portfolio like a trophy. The money cycling through Ashgrove would come back through a very different door. If the court saw this, they would not just lose money, they would lose everything. The corridor outside Court 14 smelled of old varnish and wet coats. Reporters waited with blank faces and quick hands. When the usher called us in, the chatter dropped as if someone had pulled a wire. I walked past Victoria without looking at her. Charles stood beside her, stiff, jaw tight, knuckles white at his cuff. Graham Wilcox whispered to Sir Jonathan Vale with the flustered dignity of a man who knew the floor was thin. I took my seat behind Phoebe. The clerk announced the case. Mrs. Justice Whitmore looked over her glasses and asked for silence, as if the room were not already holding its breath. The morning moved fast. Phoebe led Patel through the pattern of payments. Ashgrove, the trust, the charity, the round sums that left and came back disguised. She placed the ledger on the screen and let the initials glitter in the strip light. Victoria did not move. Charles stared at the table. Thomas Reed fidgeted with his tie as though he could turn it into rope and climb out. When Phoebe finished, the judge thanked Patel and turned to Vale. He rose and called Wilcox. Under oath, Graham looked smaller. He cleared his throat and spoke about best practice, fiduciary prudence, tax efficiency, all the safe words that have polished many lies. Phoebe stood and asked for the trustee minutes. Graham handed up bound copies. She asked about the timestamps. He said the firm clerk prepared the final versions. She asked who attended the meeting dated 3 days after my father's hospital stay. He said Edward Hart had attended by telephone and had given a clear vote. Phoebe asked for the phone records. Graham hesitated. He said he did not have them. He said he believed the call had been placed. Belief sounded weak in that room. Then Phoebe placed my father's letter on the evidence table. The clerk passed it up. The judge read it twice. Vale objected on authenticity. Phoebe nodded and called Dr. Henry Caldwell. He spoke softly about line quality, pen lift, pressure points. He did not use grand words. He did not need them. He showed the court where the hand lied. He showed how the amendment's signature sagged where my father's never sagged. He said the word simulation with a calm face. The room made a small sound, like breath taken in. Victoria leaned to speak to Vale. Charles watched the door as if it might swing open with a miracle inside. I watched Wilcox press his lips together as though the shape could make this day different. Caldwell finished. Phoebe sat. Vale stood and tried to rattle him. Caldwell did not rattle. The judge thanked him and called a short recess. Out in the corridor, Oliver stood by a window with his phone in his hand and a pale look. He said, in a voice that sounded older than him, that there was more. He had found another box in the loft above the garage. Emails printed and clipped together. A draft loan agreement between the trust and Ashgrove with a clause that gave Ashgrove the right to pledge trust assets as security for its own debts. He had taken photos, but the box itself had been moved since, and he did not know who had moved it. Phoebe took his phone and sent the files to herself. I thanked him. He nodded and looked at the floor, ashamed to share my blood. When the recess ended, the judge returned and asked for order. Phoebe recalled Wilcox for a few more questions about the amendment chain. He repeated himself. Then she asked why the company's house record listed a protected person with significant control. He said privacy rules allowed such filing. She asked if that person was Victoria. He said he could not say. She asked if it was Charles. He said he could not say. She asked if he, as solicitor, had any beneficial interest in Ashgrove. He smiled a dry smile and said absolutely not. The judge watched him the way a hawk watches a field. Then the turn came. Vale called Charles. He wanted to fix the story. He wanted a steady voice to tell the court that everything had been ordinary. Charles took the oath and spoke in a tone he used on investors. He said father had wanted stability. He said father had been clear that I was too sensitive for control. He said the trust restructuring had saved money and preserved assets. He looked at me with a small, controlled pity that had always made me feel 14. Phoebe rose. She did not force him. She let him talk. Then she placed the email about the counselor on the screen. The date stood there, clean and damning. She asked about the donation. Charles said he believed it had been for a good cause. She asked about the matching amount from Ashgrove 2 days earlier. He said he did not recall. She asked about the ledger initials. He said he did not recognize the handwriting. She asked if the handwriting was his. He said no. She asked if the ledger page was false. He said he could not say. She asked if he had ever directed Wilcox to prepare minutes that placed father at a meeting where father had not been present. He snapped that he would never falsify records. Then she placed father's hospital consultant's note on the screen, time-stamped. It showed a patient unfit to manage affairs at the very hour the minutes claimed he had chaired a vote. Something went out of Charles's face. He looked to Victoria for rescue. She folded her hands and stared at the judge. She did not move to help him. She was stone and silk. The judge asked a question then, mild in tone. She asked who had typed the minutes. Charles said the firm. She asked who had approved them. He said the trustees. She asked whether he had read them, line by line, before signing. He said yes. Then she asked why he had not noticed that his father was recorded as chairing while his father lay in a hospital bed with a mask on his face. The room held still. Charles opened his mouth, closed it, then said he had relied on professionals. Phoebe sat. Vale said he had no re-examination. The judge called Victoria. Victoria stood like a woman appointed by fate. She took the oath. She spoke with gentle certainty. She said she had served the family selflessly. She said she had made sacrifices. She said Edward had trusted her judgment above all. Her voice had the chime of polished silver. She said the letter was a misunderstanding. She said my grief had led me to read too much into a draft. She said the money flows had been lawful. She said Ashgrove was a vehicle for stability. She said I had always been impulsive. Phoebe did not raise her voice. She asked about the back staircase storeroom. Victoria said she did not manage archives. She asked about the thumb drive box. Victoria said she had never seen it. She asked about the charity donation and the counselor. Victoria said she supported many good causes. She asked whether Victoria was the protected person with significant control at Ashgrove. Victoria said she could not comment on private security measures. Phoebe asked whether she denied it. Victoria's eyes flicked to the gallery. She said the law allowed privacy for those at risk. Phoebe asked what risk she faced. Victoria hesitated. Then she said very softly that wealth attracts hostility. The mask began to slip. Margaret's hands twisted in her lap. Thomas stared at the floor. Oliver stared at his shoes as if they could open and swallow him. I felt pity and anger wrestle inside me like dogs. I wanted to hurt the people who had tried to erase me. I wanted to run from the sight of them breaking. Phoebe placed the draft letter from my father to Wilcox on the screen. The one that said no change to the trust would be valid without my written consent, dated a week before the amendment that bore his name. The judge leaned forward. Vale rose to object. The judge overruled him. Phoebe asked Victoria to read the date aloud. She did. Her voice trembled on the last digit. Phoebe asked whether Victoria had seen this draft before today. Victoria said no. Phoebe asked whether she understood what it meant for the amendment if the signature was false. Victoria said she believed the signature was real. Phoebe asked her to look at Caldwell's report again. Victoria's mouth pressed thin. Then something happened that I had wanted and dreaded. She looked at Charles, and the look was raw. She wanted him to save her. He looked back and gave her nothing. She said that the solicitor had handled everything. She said she had trusted his expertise. She said if there were irregularities, she had not known. Wilcox made a sound that might have been a laugh or a choke. He asked the judge for permission to answer. The judge told him to wait his turn. Phoebe asked Victoria whether she had ever asked Wilcox to backdate a document. Victoria said never. Phoebe placed an email on the screen. A single line. Please adjust the draft so the vote falls before the consultant's note. The sender line carried Victoria's initials and her private address. The timestamp sat like a pin in the air. Victoria closed her eyes. For a moment she looked as if she could not find a place to put her face. The sound in the room changed. It was not loud, but it had the texture of something breaking. Margaret began to cry silently, shoulders shaking. Thomas whispered her name and reached for her hand. She pulled away. Oliver put both hands over his mouth. Charles stared at the email as if it were a gun pointed at him. Vale asked for a short adjournment. The judge granted 15 minutes. We filed out. In the corridor, the family exploded. Low voices at first, then words that cut. Margaret turned on Victoria with red eyes. She said she had warned her that pride would ruin them. Thomas said nothing, then said too much. He said he had signed papers he did not read because Victoria told him it was routine. He said he had trusted Graham because Graham had always worn the right suit. He said he would not go to prison for anyone. The word prison made a reporter lift his head like a dog hearing meat hit a plate. Charles rounded on Wilcox. He said this was his fault. He said a competent solicitor would have kept them safe. Graham said he had followed instructions. He said he had warned them that minutes must match fact. He said they had told him to make it neat. Victoria said he was lying. Her voice cracked on the last word. For the first time since my father's funeral, I saw her look unsure. Oliver stepped back from the circle as if it might burn him. He looked at me and shook his head. I could not tell if he meant I'm sorry or I'm done. Margaret cried harder. Mascara left 2 gray streaks. Thomas repeated that he would not carry this. Charles ran a hand through his hair and left it there like he had forgotten where it belonged. The family that had choreographed every dinner now flailed in public like actors who had lost the script. I stood apart and felt a war inside me. Part of me wanted to take no pleasure in this, to remember that these were people who had shared Christmas and bread and photographs. Another part of me remembered the drawing room, the way they stripped my place and my name in front of my own blood. That part remembered my father's letter and the plastic sleeve where I had hidden it the day I almost broke. Rage and sadness moved inside me in waves. I held on to the rail and let both pass without drowning. The usher called us back. In the well of the court, faces were raw. Victoria's gaze had lost its perfect polish. Charles looked older. Graham looked gray. Margaret held a tissue like a white flag. Thomas blinked as if light hurt. The judge took her seat and asked for quiet. Vale said his clients denied wrongdoing. The judge said denial was an answer, not a shield. She ordered immediate disclosure of devices and servers. She warned that failure would draw sanctions that would bite. Her voice did not rise. It did not need to. Phoebe rose and asked for a freezing order over assets connected to Ashgrove. The judge asked 2 questions, then granted the order to preserve the field until trial. A small gasp ran through the gallery. I felt my heart slow for the first time in weeks. Not joy, not yet. Relief is a thin fruit. It feeds, but it does not fill. As we left, Margaret touched my sleeve. Her hand shook. She said my name the way she had said it when I fell from a bicycle at 9 and skinned both knees. She said she had been blind. She said she had believed what suited her. She asked if I could find a way to spare her. Tears shone on her face. Behind her, Charles watched, jaw set. Victoria stood very still, a statue that had learned fear. Graham spoke to no one. Thomas whispered a prayer into his fist. One of them begged me for mercy, but I remembered what they did to me. The trial days blurred into one another. Paper towers grew higher. Witnesses repeated the same lines until their voices sounded rehearsed even when they were not. The press outside grew sharper, twisting every whisper into a headline. And yet, as the evidence piled up, I began to feel the thin thread of fear. What if none of this mattered? Because influence has a way of bending justice. My family had spent decades curating their image, cultivating relationships, buying loyalty with charity galas and polished smiles. They had friends in parliament, friends on councils, friends who shook hands at dinners where my name was never spoken. I knew the truth, but truth in a courtroom is not always enough. Judges are human. Humans feel pressure. Mrs. Justice Whitmore sat straight-backed every morning, spectacles low on her nose, her pen tapping at intervals that became a language of their own. When Phoebe delivered her submissions, the judge listened, but her expression stayed unreadable. When Vale cross-examined Oliver until his words tangled, the judge intervened with courtesy, but no more. When Caldwell repeated that the signature was simulated, the judge simply nodded and wrote a note. She gave nothing away. Each day I sat there, my father's letter folded in my bag, and wondered if all of this would end in compromise. A deal. A settlement. A half measure that let Victoria and Charles walk away with their heads still high, their reputation bruised but intact. That thought haunted me more than defeat, because partial justice would be its own betrayal. The tension peaked on the 6th day. Phoebe applied to admit Oliver's new evidence, the draft loan agreements and the counselor emails. Vale fought it with every weapon he had, arguing lateness, irrelevance, confidentiality. He said the documents were misunderstood, that Oliver had exceeded authority, that their disclosure would prejudice fairness. The judge leaned back, pen resting against her chin. She asked sharp questions of Phoebe. Had the chain of custody been preserved? Could we prove authenticity? Would admitting them delay trial? Each question felt like a knife slicing our case thinner. I gripped the rail in front of me, praying that Phoebe's calm answers would hold. She explained the metadata, the timing, the supporting bank statements. She showed that the documents fit the web already proved. Still, the judge hesitated. She said the court had to balance fairness and efficiency. She said the family's right to defend themselves could not be undercut. She said she would reserve her decision until morning. That night, I walked the embankment with the city lights blurring in the Thames. I thought of Father's voice, telling me to read slowly. I thought of Victoria's hand pressing over mine, commanding gratitude as she cut me out of my own bloodline. I thought of Oliver's whispered apology. And for the first time since the claim began, I let myself feel afraid. If the judge refused the evidence, half the truth would stay buried. And if half the truth stayed buried, my family would twist the rest into a mask they could wear in public. When I returned home, I found an envelope under my door. No name. Inside, a single sheet of lined paper. Handwritten, block letters. It said, "Not all of us agreed. Look to the foundation accounts." No signature. No clue. But the handwriting was old-fashioned, letters straight and severe. Whoever had written it wanted me to see another thread. I handed it to Phoebe in the morning. She frowned, but she did not dismiss it. She said we would request disclosure of the Hart Foundation's records. Then the clerk called us back in. The judge returned, face set. She ruled that Oliver's documents would be admitted, subject to proof. Relief swept the bench on our side. Vale stood stiff, lips pressed. The walls held steady for now. But something still gnawed. I watched Victoria whisper to Charles, saw their barrister pass notes under the table, saw Wilcox staring at the floor like he wished it would open. They still had cards hidden. They would play them at the moment it mattered most. That moment came sooner than I expected. When Phoebe began examining Oliver, Vale rose with sudden heat. He accused Oliver of theft, of betrayal, of fabricating evidence to curry favor with me. He accused him of desperation. Oliver tried to hold steady, but his words faltered under the weight. The judge asked him to answer plainly. Oliver explained how he found the box, how he took photos, how he feared the documents would vanish. Vale scoffed, called it convenient. Then he delivered the line that chilled me. This witness is motivated not by truth, but by revenge. I saw Oliver's hands shake. He looked at me, pale and cornered. The judge's pen tapped. My heart sank. Influence did not need to shout, it just needed doubt. And then, from the back of the court, a voice spoke. I can confirm his account. The room turned. Margaret Reed, my aunt, stood. Her tissue still clutched in one hand, her face raw from days of tears. She asked permission to speak. The judge raised her brows, considered, then nodded. Margaret took the oath with trembling fingers. Her voice was thin at first, but each sentence grew firmer. She admitted she had seen Victoria and Charles meeting with Wilcox late at night while Father slept. She admitted she had signed papers without reading them because Victoria told her they were routine. She admitted that when Oliver showed her the ledger, she had recognized Victoria's handwriting in the margins but stayed silent out of fear. Vale tried to interrupt. The judge silenced him with a raised hand. Margaret pressed on. She said that Father had confided in her once, weeks before his death. He had said he feared Victoria wanted control at any cost. He had said he trusted me more than anyone. Her voice cracked then, and she sobbed into the tissue, but she did not retract her words. The silence that followed felt alive. For the first time, Victoria's mask slipped fully. She turned to Margaret with eyes like glass knives. Charles muttered something under his breath, fists clenched. Wilcox's face turned gray. Phoebe rose gently, asked only 2 questions. Did Margaret believe Oliver's evidence was genuine? Yes. Did she believe Father intended me as trustee? Yes. That was all. The judge thanked her, voice level but eyes sharp. She turned back to Vale and asked if he wished to cross-examine. He tried, but Margaret's broken voice carried a weight his polished sentences could not cut. The gallery whispered. Reporters scribbled furiously. For the first time, the balance felt different. I sat frozen, emotions warring. Margaret had betrayed me in silence before. She had sat in that drawing room and watched while Victoria stripped me of dignity. And yet here she was, shaking, crying, giving me the truth I had prayed someone else would confirm. A part of me wanted to forgive her. Another part wanted to remember how it felt to be erased. The judge adjourned for lunch. Outside, the family exploded again. Victoria accused Margaret of treachery. Charles shouted that she had ruined them. Thomas tried to calm them, but his voice shook. Oliver looked at me with eyes wide, as if he could not believe what had just happened. I felt dizzy, because neither could I. Back inside, the judge warned the parties that the case was moving toward findings of dishonesty. She said the weight of evidence demanded full candor. She ordered immediate inspection of the foundation accounts, the same accounts hinted at in that anonymous letter. Phoebe squeezed my hand under the bench. The tide was turning, but even as hope flickered, I felt the unease. Margaret's testimony had shaken the mask, yes, but it had also opened another door. Because if the foundation accounts revealed what I feared, if the donations and land deals stretched deeper, then the scandal would reach beyond my family. Counselors, charities, public trust. That would make enemies far larger than Victoria. Enemies who would not care that I was only seeking justice. As the judge rose, I caught Margaret's eye. She gave me a small nod, timid, fragile, but real. I could not yet bring myself to nod back. My heart was torn between gratitude and suspicion, because Margaret Reed was the last person I had ever expected to speak up. The clerk called us in, and the room felt like held breath. The foundation accounts had arrived at dawn with an urgency stamp and 2 security bags. Phoebe stood with a stack of schedules, her eyes steady. Vale sat very still, as if stillness could push back a tide. Victoria's face was set the way stone sets. Charles's hands opened and closed on his lap, as if he were trying to hold air. Phoebe began with the same calm that had carried me through each day. She walked the court through line items and ledgers until patterns formed like frost on glass. The foundation had sent money to a small arts charity. The week planning consent was smoothed. The same day, Ashgrove received a consultancy payment from the trust. 2 weeks later, identical funds appeared in a personal account linked to a shell. The judge followed with her pen, tapping only when something lined up with an earlier mark. Vale's objections came and went, neat and bloodless. They did nothing to stop the shape taking form. But money alone would not end this. Money can hide. Words can be denied. I needed a voice that could not be polished away. In my bag lay the small wooden box from Father's desk. I had opened it again last night. Inside the thumb drive were the letters I had already given to the court, and something else in a folder I had missed before. A file with a date stamp from 3 weeks before he died. The file name was plain. Note for Adam. I had played it once at my kitchen table and pressed my hand to my mouth so I would not make a sound. Phoebe had asked me if I was ready to put it on the record. I said yes. I said I had waited for this moment since the hour I watched my name slide off a will like wet ink. She asked the judge for permission to play a short recording recovered from Edward Hart's personal device. Vale stood and talked about foundation of evidence and admissibility and fairness. Phoebe explained. Chain of custody and the forensic report confirming the file's creation date and hash. The judge looked down at the letters already in evidence. She looked at Caldwell's report. She looked at me. Then she granted permission. The clerk lifted the small speaker to the bench. The room went so quiet I could hear my own pulse. Phoebe nodded. The sound began. My father's voice filled the court. It was not strong, but it was unmistakable. He spoke as he always did when he wanted no one to misunderstand. He said my name. He said, "If you are hearing this, something has gone wrong." He said that he had told Wilcox to draft a deed, that no change to the Hart Family Settlement would be valid without my signed consent, and that any structure moving control to Ashgrove would be a breach of his direction. He said he did not trust Victoria with stewardship. He said that I had judgment, that I did not confuse love with money. He asked me to read slowly. I closed my eyes when he said those words and felt the court move around me like a deep wave. Then the second voice came. A door opened in the recording. Chairs drew back. Footsteps. Victoria spoke, almost cheerful, the voice she used with people she wanted to own. She asked if Father felt well enough to sign a few things, and said Graham had brought papers. Father coughed. He said later. He said his head was heavy. His voice broke on the word heavy. Victoria's tone cooled by a degree. She said they could sign tomorrow, and she would have Graham frame the minutes. Graham's voice, formal and smooth, came in like a practiced answer. He said he would note Father's direction on the record, and there was a small pause that sounded like a man writing a lie. The recording ended with Father saying very softly, "Do not let them rush you, Adam." Then silence. Someone in the gallery made a noise they could not swallow. Vale stood so quickly his chair scraped. He said the recording was incomplete, that context was missing, that memory was a trick of sound. The judge lifted a hand to quiet him and asked Phoebe about dates and file provenance again. Phoebe walked her through the forensic report line by line. The judge nodded, once. I looked at Victoria. Her face had not moved, but the stillness was not strength now. It was absence. Charles stared at the table as if the wood might break into flames. Wilcox had gone pale in a way I had not seen since the first day. Phoebe sat down slowly. My heart pounded, but I felt clear, the way cold water makes a wound honest. Still, we knew a voice could be met with denial. We needed a point that cut through evasions and plans. We needed someone from the inside of their machine. The usher announced the next witness. Patel returned to map one more cycle of funds. Then came a short, thin woman in a navy cardigan, hair pinned back, no makeup. The clerk swore her in. She gave her name and title, data manager at the firm of Wilcox & Carr. My stomach tightened. Phoebe had not told me of this one. She had kept her for this hour. Phoebe asked simple questions. The woman answered with care. She said she had been in charge of server backups and access logs. She said she had been instructed to apply a retention policy last autumn that shortened the life of certain files. She had refused without written instruction. She had then downloaded a set of logs to a secure drive because she believed someone would try to clean the record. She had not wished to accuse anyone without cause. She had waited. She had watched. Then the preservation order had come, and she had decided she could speak. Phoebe asked about the minutes of the meeting held 3 days after the hospital note. The witness said the minutes had been created 6 weeks later and backdated in the document properties, then flattened to PDF to remove edit history. She identified the user account from which the final file had been generated. She named it GW Sr. Every line of Wilcox's face seemed to fight itself. Vale objected with force now, but the judge admitted the logs subject to cross-examination. Phoebe put the logs on the screen. Metadata that most people never think about shone like daylight. The creation date, the author tags, the time zone offsets. The story of the file told against the words it contained. The witness continued. She had also preserved compressed archives of Wilcox's email account. Phoebe showed a short exchange between Wilcox and Victoria's private address. The subject line was minutes. The body read, understood. Will tidy. Please destroy earlier drafts. Victoria's reply read, make it neat. The timestamps sat next to the consultant's note time like two hands on a clock pointing at each other. I felt the room tip. I waited for the denial, the cool deflection. Victoria did not move. Charles lifted his face and looked at Wilcox with something that was not anger now. It was fear and hate, and the loss of any story he had told himself to sleep. Vale called the witness a traitor. He said she had breached duty. She said her duty was to the law. Her voice did not rise. The judge thanked her. Then the judge invited submissions on the recording and the logs. Vale spoke well. He tried to carve doubt into every line. He used all the right phrases. Phoebe spoke last. She did not fill the room. She cut a clean path. She said that taken together, the letter, the recording, the logs, the payments, and the ledger formed a single rope. She asked the court to pull on it. The judge sat for a long time without speaking. She read her notes. She looked at the exhibits. She looked at Victoria, at Charles, at Wilcox, and then at me. I saw the weight of it on her face. Not pressure from names and dinners, but the weight of what a court is meant to carry. I wondered if she would step around it. I wondered if she would choose the safe path and invite a settlement. It would have been easy to call it too messy and send us to a quiet room with a mediator and a pot of tea. Part of me wanted the rest this instant. Another part knew that rest without truth would rot me from the inside. She began to speak. She said that this was not judgment, but she would give strong indications. She said the amendment bore signs consistent with simulation and that she placed significant weight on Dr. Caldwell's evidence. She said the minutes could not be relied upon in light of the logs. She said the recording carried probative value and aligned with the contemporaneous letters. She said the flow of funds from the trust to Ashgrove and into related accounts raised questions of dishonesty that could not be explained away by words like restructuring or efficiency. She said she would be appointing a receiver over the trust pending final decision. She said she would refer the matter to the authorities. She said she would order a full account of profits and consider removal of trustees. By the time she reached the last clause, the courtroom had changed. The gallery breathed out as one. Reporters burst into motion. A murmur rose like weather. Vale sat down hard, as if someone had taken the floor out from under him. Patel exhaled and pressed 2 fingers to his eyes. Oliver covered his face with his hands. Thomas stared at Victoria as if waiting for her to pull a lever and reset the room. Margaret wept openly. Graham Wilcox closed his eyes and lowered his head onto his hands. I felt the air move around me as if the building itself had lifted and settled again. It was not triumph in the way I had imagined it alone at my kitchen table. It was not a cheer or a shout. It was quiet and fierce and hot behind my eyelids. My hands shook. I set them flat on my knees. I thought of Father's voice saying my name. I thought of the way he signed his H. I thought of how far I had come from the day I stood in the drawing room and listened to my life being cut into smaller pieces. Then the last blow fell, and it did not come from me. It came from the person who had spent a career speaking in polished lines. Wilcox rose without being called. He asked to make a statement. Vale tried to restrain him with a hand on his sleeve. He shook it off. He said he accepted the court's indication. He said the firm would cooperate with the receiver. He said he had acted on instructions and had believed he was helping a family preserve a legacy. He said that belief had led him to bend lines that must not be bent. Then he turned to Victoria and said that he would not carry this alone. He said he had emails and drafts and notes that had not yet been produced. He said he would hand them over immediately. Charles made a sound like a man who has been punched in the back. Victoria did not look at Wilcox. She stared at me with a look I had never seen. No control, no pity, no mask. Just a cold, wounded creature who could not believe that a house she had built from fear and obedience had fallen in under a single voice and a set of dates. Phoebe squeezed my wrist so hard it hurt. I did not pull away. Pain made it real. The judge ordered custody of devices then and there. She called for an officer to attend the corridors. She stood the case down for the day with directions that would keep everyone busy for weeks. As we rose, the room moved with the rustle of a storm passing over. A reporter called my name and asked how it felt. I could not answer. Words formed and fell apart on my tongue. In the corridor, the family stood in fragments. Margaret reached for me and stopped, her hand hanging in the space between us. Charles stared at a crack in the wall as if it had not been there yesterday. Thomas spoke into his hands, the same small prayer he had repeated all week. Oliver leaned against the glass and looked out at a sky that had decided on rain. Victoria stepped forward. She stopped an arm's length away. I could smell her perfume, the one she wore to every dinner she wanted to win. She opened her mouth. No words came. She closed it. Then she drew a breath and spoke one sentence. She said, "You have no idea what this will set loose." Not a threat, not power, a prophecy. I looked at her and thought of counselors and charities and handshakes that would now look like evidence. I thought of the anonymous letter. I thought of names that had not yet been spoken in court. Reporters crowded in. Security pushed back. Phoebe moved me toward the stairs. My legs carried me down like they remembered a road my mind did not yet believe I had reached. Outside, the air tasted like wet steel. Cameras flashed. Someone shouted my name again. I walked on. At the edge of the steps I stopped and looked back through the glass. For a second, I saw my reflection next to theirs. The boy who had once been seated at the side of a table in his own house stood next to a man who had dragged a line through a lie and watched it split. I thought I might feel only victory. What I felt was bigger and darker and cleaner than that. It was relief and grief and a wide-open quiet. It was the knowledge that I had done what I had promised myself on the night I found the first piece of evidence. I had set the match. Phoebe asked if I was all right. I nodded and found my voice. I said that I wanted to walk by the river. She said she would come with me. We moved through the crush until the noise thinned. On the embankment, the rain began. I let it soak my hair and did not raise my umbrella. The city looked different. Not kinder, not softer, just honest. I thought of Father's last words on that recording. Do not let them rush you. I had not rushed. I had waited. I had read slowly. I had learned what silence can do. Behind me, a phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number. 2 words, not over. No punctuation. The same block hand as the first note. I showed it to Phoebe. She read it and nodded once. Not fear. Recognition. There are always more doors when you push one open. I turned my face up to the rain and let it wash the salt from my skin. People walked past with their coats pulled tight. A bus sighed to a stop and moved on. Somewhere a siren cut through the wet air and faded. I had wanted a day when everything would be simple again. That day did not exist. The court had given me truth and the beginning of justice. It had also given me a new edge to live on. I could not pretend I was the same person who had walked into the drawing room at Hart House and asked for trustee minutes like a boy asking for a story. That person was gone. I stood on the river wall and looked at the dark surface and saw my face, not as a crest on a shield, but as a witness who had carried a voice into a room and watched a house fall. But even as they fell, I realized I had changed forever. The courtrooms emptied. The headlines faded, replaced by new scandals, new noise. But for me, silence returned in pieces, slow, patient, and heavier than I expected. For months, letters came from the receiver, the investigators, the charities, the councils. Each envelope was another stone in the wall of consequences. Victoria's assets were frozen. Charles resigned from every board. Wilcox was suspended, then disbarred. Some of the counselors who had smiled for photographs with her name on their checks found their faces on the front page instead. The Hart Foundation was placed under independent trustees. The estate was under audit. Justice had teeth, but it also had limits. Money could be traced. Signatures could be proved false. But what I could never reclaim was time. There were days I woke up thinking of Father, of how he used to lean on the garden fence, cigarette in hand, eyes half closed. As if the whole world were a story, he was still deciding whether to believe. He had built everything from discipline and silence. I had used silence to dismantle what his trust had become. Sometimes I wondered if I had done what he would have wanted. Then I would play that recording again, just the first few seconds, the way he said my name, calm and certain. If you are hearing this, something has gone wrong. And I would remember why I began. Truth does not repair what it breaks. It does not give back the years that rot quietly while you wait for people to do the right thing. But it cleans the air. It stops the decay. It lets the next breath feel real again. I visited Hart House once more, months later, after the receiver's notice arrived. The gates were chained. The gravel path was overgrown. The garden, which once smelled of control, smelled now of rain and moss and something freer. Through the window, I saw my reflection in the glass beside Father's portrait. For a long moment, we looked at each other, not as heir and patriarch, but as two men who had both learned that truth is the only inheritance worth keeping. The world outside the estate moved on. People forgot the names. But inside me, something stayed still, a line written in Father's hand, pressed deep enough into paper to leave a scar beneath it. I walked back down the lane with no one following, no name to protect, and no mask to wear. And I thought of his last words again. Do not let them rush you. This time I smiled, because I had not rushed. I had waited. I had read slowly. And in the end, the truth spoke for itself.